Hello, everyone. Welcome to the alt.ctrl panel. Thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to moderate this panel with these incredibly talented game designers that I have sitting next to me. Alt.ctrl is something that is really important to me as a game designer, is really important to the to MAGFest. The Indie Arcade is one of the most special sacred places of MAGFest for me. So I'm excited to get into more about what makes alt.ctrl games, where these designers are coming from, and sort of how this alt.ctrl scene operates, where you draw inspiration, etc. So I'm going to start by introducing myself real quick. I'm Emily Koonce. I'm your moderator for this panel. I am a professor at DePaul University, and I'm a part of the curation team for the MAGFest Indie Arcade, so I've gotten to look at all of your work very closely. I'm also an expert on folk games, so I love the kind of intersection of alt.ctrl and how they kind of create their own mini folk games practices and being this kind of weird experience that players interact with in these spaces. And now I'll kick it off to Erin to introduce themselves.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Erin Truesdell. My pronouns are she, her. I am an assistant professor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. You probably recognize me as the person who is often standing under the giant hat, which is why I don't have my voice all the way here right now. And I get to work with alt.ctrl a lot as part of my research. I have used kind of academic research as a way to do alt.ctrl for a living, which has been really phenomenal. And I mostly focus on how people collaborate when we put alt.ctrls in front of them. So Haberdasher is my big one. Many of you have probably played it. I think some of you are here because you played it and I told you to come to this panel, so thanks for coming by. I also have another game that I would love to bring here at some point called Trip, A Cosmic Adventure for Two, which is a asymmetrical game about doing acid in space and hallucinating while trying to fly a spaceship. And it's really hilarious and it's very chaotic. Finally, this is maybe the most and least sexy part of my work at the same time, but this is a new kind of chart I invented to describe what people do when they play with the big hat game. And you can read more about that on my website because I don't want to bore you with it right now.
Okay, now I would like to introduce Miki Strauss.
Hi, I'm Miki. My pronouns are he, they. Right now I'm a freelance programmer and illustrator, and alt.ctrl is very much like an artistic exploration for me that I'm mostly showcasing in Chicago, but I've been showcasing with my project partner, Michelle, at MAGFest since 2019, so I've been here for a while. The game that I have here with another friend is called Blood Rage Fight Club. It's a punching bag game. It is a party game, so we do have a tournament happening tomorrow at 2 p.m. It involves betting mechanics and fake money and screwing over people you don't like. This was a game I showed in Chicago a few months ago. This used a Wii balance board. You're a big monster stomping through the city, but you don't want to hurt anybody. Cosmic Crash was another game that I showed at MAGFest with Michelle last year. This game was about trying to over-encumber the player as much as possible, which I think we did a little too much of. And this was another party game that me and my other project partner, Kana, made. This was a seance simulator that involved everyone having to hold hands to run a seance, and you would jump in and out of the seance as prompts asked you to.
And now I'd like to introduce Robin Baumgarten.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Robin Baumgarten. I'm here from Germany today, from Berlin, where I'm based now, and I make installation art. So I started in video games, so mobile games a while ago, and then I got into alt.ctrl tinkering, and so then 10 years ago I made a game that some of you might know called Line Wobbler. That's been here. I think it's been a staple, and it's kind of surreal because it's my first time at MAGFest, but my game has been here like, I don't know, 5-6 times or something. So it's kind of strange that people know my work and then say, hey, you made this, and it's very cool to see that. But that was also my first bigger entry into physical stuff, and that was still 10 years ago. And I've been working, and I like working with springs and LEDs, so I've been doing that, and I thought, okay, what if we add more springs? And so now I made what is also here called Quantum Jungle, and that's a large wall filled with doorstop springs. And this isn't quite a game anymore, it's more like an art science installation. So this one has something to do with quantum physics, where I visualize how quantum particle moves. If you remember Schrödinger's cat, it's very similar to that. That was made together with the university, and now I build these for science centers and museums, and luckily can also do this full time, so it's quite cool. And then I do some small installations, small experiments. I haven't really shown any of these much except for alt.ctrl GDC. Some of them also use springs, some are sliders. There's one with a knife on a motor, which I really like. But yes, so like lots of little experiments.
Okay, amazing. So these are all very different projects that you have brought. We have a giant hat to a tiny knife on a motor. How did all of you get started in this work? Like, what was your introduction to the alt scene world? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Miki.
Oh, okay. So I think it was actually in college. I had a class about experimental programming with my friend Michelle out here. And it was kind of random that we applied to MAGFest with a game we made called Soaring Scurry, which was like a 2-player bird racing game where you kind of chicken dance basically to play the game. And the reception at MAGFest was like, it kind of like really inspired us. We realized that the spectacle of making people chicken dance in front of like a huge room was really fun, and people really seemed to enjoy that. And I think that kind of kept pushing us to be like, what other like weird, dumb things can we make people do? So that's how I got started with this.
Amazing. How about you, Erin?
The first alt-control game I ever played was Line Wobbler. Robin came to my college classroom when I was much younger and had blue hair. And I said, wait, this is cool. And then about 4 years later, I went to my first alt-control GDC and fell in love with alt-control there. One of the games that kind of sticks in my mind from that year was a game called Hot Swap, which was a game where you and a friend are trying to pilot a boat that is actively falling apart, but you only have one set of controls, and you have to hand the pieces to each other. And by hand, I mean throw, and by coordinate, I mean screaming. And I realized that like there is something very cool here. And then as I worked my way through graduate school, realized that this was a thing that people in the academic world are doing, and I get to hang out with them all now and do stuff like come to MAGFest and inflict my giant hat on people, which is very cool.
Yeah, Robin, you give us a little bit of context of how your background, but how, like, what inspired you to jump into alt control?
So yeah, I think like I had a phase of where I was addicted to game jams. It was like, there was 1 year where I did 50 game jams in a year. It's like one a week almost. It was crazy. But I loved doing game jams at first only digitally, but then I had this little hobby of just tinkering with electronics. And that was when Arduino was just picking up, and it's like relatively easy to interface Unity, like a game development engine, to hardware. And so I started doing this at jams only, so like using like one little sensor, one little thing, and that's how it got started. It's just like doing little experiments that I throw away immediately afterwards. And at some point something sticks, so Line Wobbler came out of one of those jams. So it was basically almost made in 48 hours. Obviously not as polished or anything, but that's how it got started. And then people liked it and just snowballed from there.
Yeah, it's interesting because it feels like you two almost frame this as like, oh, I like to watch people interact with this thing, and you kind of started small with like, oh, what can I do with this hardware, and let it like build its way up into this culture. But it's cool how like prolific these pieces are by virtue of their sheer size, or like Line Wobbler also I associate with MAGFest, like I was telling you, is just like such a part of the architecture here almost. So why do you think, or what is it about alt control that makes it so iconic and so memorable? Do you have any ideas about that, Erin, with a giant bowler hat?
So yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. I might accidentally answer a question you have maybe for later. But one of the big potentials I see with alt control, and one of the things I love the most about being an alt control developer, is the level of flexibility that you get. So you are you're not restricted by things like how big your controller is going to be or whether or not it can be mass produced. Like, this is the only field where you can build a giant hat that's a controller. And so what that leads to is all kinds of wacky things. And a couple of those are going to be iconic, whether because they're big, whether because they're a one-dimensional dungeon crawler that runs on a door spring, which is wild. and so what happens is this field kind of enables you to build stuff like that. And that's, I think, where a lot of the fun is trying to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, the boundlessness of working with technology that hasn't like existed yet in your vision of it, I guess. Why do you think Line Wobbler has taken? I saw on your website, Line Wobbler has been shown at over 100 events and exhibitions, which is like crazy for a game that's only existed for like a decade.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to figure out myself how this works, right? But it's, I think it came early in a phase of alt.ctrl where it was just starting as well. And luckily also with the spring, it was fairly robust for an alt.ctrl game. And often, I mean, we have all this problem that you have built something over, weeks and months, and you present it to someone, and the first player just rips it apart right away. Said, oh shit, out of order, and that's an essential part. But it's also like a bit of fun, like this panic fixing again. And maybe with Line Wobbler, it got robust over the first, 20, 30 exhibitions. So then it was there, and I was comfortable shipping it to places. So right, I had one at Baby Castles, right? So then that was the one that came here, I think. And there's a few all over the place, like in Wonderville now, in different places in the world, which is really cool. And so now I have like a little maintenance manual so people can fix it by themselves. So I think that helps get it into the world. And I made it 10 years ago, and I think that was also the point where museums decided, okay, games can be art now. And before that it was like, nah, this is all like just nonsense. And so there is exhibitions in museums, but also like here, where you can play games that are not just on a screen, because you can do that at home, right? And I think that's also where alt.ctrl fits in, where it's like, oh, we can play something weird here, which we can only play here, right? And this is really the place to shine for alt.ctrl games, I feel like, where it's like, you need to be there in person, you need to have seen it, and then it's like word of mouth, but you can't really download it on Steam usually, and it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that like that draws people in. This kind of like, not only as a designer, do you feel this unlimitedness of like you don't have to think about making it commercial? I guess you have a little bit as you're designing a manual for it for people to run it, but also for players, this kind of like experience that I can't get anywhere else. Miki, how about you in terms of like what makes alt.ctrl so prolific? Do you feel like it's related to this kind of like spectacle you were talking about, like watching people perform because they're using the technology that you've made?
Yeah, I feel like actually I have like kind of a two-part answer to that. Definitely the first part is that spectacle. I think both spectacle and like the crowd psychology, basically. When you're in that crowd and everyone's being really, really weird and that kind of energy starts ramping up, I think it allows the players to get into a state of mind that you don't necessarily get in like a conventional game, where it's like, I'm asking you to do these very big motions that aren't necessarily like okay to do. You can't just go up to people and start punching them. But in this space, you're like encouraged to do that, and then the crowd starts screaming at you to keep doing this, and now suddenly you are someone that is punching a stranger, and you are screaming at someone. And I like that kind of suspension of the self, almost, where you're like, all right, I'm just doing this. And I think another like reason that alt.controller can be really iconic and prolific is that it's like an inherently playful way to view the world. I think I really like taking very everyday objects like a punching bag, or Michelle and I have a game downstairs also with like these stuffed animal horses. Taking everyday materials and being like, okay, what if this was a controller? Like, we used to have this exercise, me and Michelle, where we'd go to like Five Below and just like pick up a random like a toilet cleaner and be like, what if we made a game out of this? Like, how would this be a controller? And I think seeing other games use mundane objects like a door spring or a hat and being like, this is a game now, I think it's just a different way to view the world and like a playful way to view things around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think all of you have some experience working in game development capacities that aren't alt.control, or in tech that is unrelated to this kind of world. in terms of like not only the creativity that you bring to the design by like being like I can turn anything into a controller, but also the development process. How does that differ with alt control versus a traditional like tech or game development project?
Something I've noticed really like as a big difference is the scale of the game itself. With alt controller games, you can't really ask people to be spending like hours playing it, so you are making these shorter, more ephemeral experiences that have to just be like quick things, versus like when I'm programming for a longer based narrative game, this is going to be different way I'm thinking about mechanics. You want to actually keep players there for a longer time. So that's one big difference I've noticed.
Do you feel this is that's similar to how you've been working, especially as you've moved into like playful installations as well? The kind of like brevity that you might have with a player interaction, does that factor into your design?
Well, it's an outcome in a way, but for me, my design approach is fairly bottom up. So it's different, I guess, from when you start a big software project or a digital game project where you say, oh, this needs to be the next Dark Souls or whatever. But for me, it's a bottom up approach where I start with the actual physical hardware. So a bit like Miki was saying, like, oh, I find an object or even a sensor. So like it could be, a pressure sensor. And then you say, okay, what game can we make with a pressure sensor? Like, okay, maybe you need to run up and down stairs, and that becomes its own thing. So for me, it's definitely much, the experiment is first, and then we'll see, does anything come out of it? And very often the answer is no. So it's like, it's like, okay, this is fun for 5 seconds, or this is fun for a little bit. But sometimes you find something, and then you kind of try to hone in, okay, how can this be interactive? How can this be a game? How can this be fun for longer or shorter? But this comes definitely second for me. So for me, it's just the experimentation. And then maybe it goes also back to like how alt control is different for me to normal development, and is because it started for me as a way to do something real, right? I'm a programmer by education, so it's all digital. It's all like just lines on a screen. But doing something with your hands really feels much more rewarding for me, or like almost like switching off, even though it's still digital and code. So for me, it was also like self-realization, just building something with my hands, and I wasn't even thinking about what comes out on the other end at first. It's just, that's a happy accident in the end.
Yeah. So having that kind of analog control mindset versus like living in code in your computer science background programming. I'm curious for you, Aaron, as someone who your academic work is in like how people interact with alt controls, and the different way that affects players, like in playing a game with an alt control versus playing with a traditional control scheme. How does that impact the way you design and your development process?
So a lot of the academic tie-ins to my work really drive what gets made of my work, because the things that get made are the things that I can get funding for and can publish on. But at the same time, I'm afforded enough flexibility that I can build a lot of weird things. And so I think one of the really fun parts about alt control is the experimental nature of the development process. Like when you design a traditional game, your goal is to make a really smooth player experience almost all the time, make it satisfying, make it however long, and make it like feel really good, and maybe have your code be super optimized. And the alt control process kind of flies in the face of all of that, because there's just constant experimentation, and half the stuff you try doesn't work, and half the stuff you try does work and then it breaks. And so it's a lot of back and forth, and you get to kind of still enjoy the aspect of digital game development with that satisfaction of having built something and the satisfaction of getting to put a physical thing in front of people. And the reason I do collaborative alt controllers is because I know, at least for me, and especially during COVID, it's like I am sick of staring at screens all of the time. All of my social life happens on a screen, and I love playing co-op games, but I can only stare at my computer for so many hours. And so I love doing co-op games because it is a physical thing, and I force people to be friends with each other in meet space as part of my job. And I think there's a lot of value in that personal IRL interaction, and alt control is a really great way to support that.
How do you think this nature of like the only way that we can really play these games are in person, because it's something that you touch, like it's part of the design process, it's part of the player experience, it's something that's in front of them. for the community of people who make these games, how do you think that changes the way that artists who work in the alt control space relate to each other?
So I really enjoy that very tactile aspect and collaborative aspect of alt controller. I was originally like an animation major, so I'm very much interested in storytelling, and I think the tactile nature of alt controller is a storytelling mechanic in itself, because you are quite literally immersed in the game, in the world. Now you are the fighter or the cowboy or whatever, right? And I think that that's just a really fun tool for artists to get their viewers to engage with their story and their work and their message in like a very quite literally hands-on way.
Yeah, I'm curious for you, Robin, whose game has been shown in like all over the world in different countries and different continents. Is there any kind of like similarities, I guess, between the way people interact even across all these different cultural contexts and cultural spaces?
Yeah, so I mean, there is several things there, I guess. So one is also when you show it in a lot of different environments, you also need to find a way to talk to the people, right? And I find it really tricky. For example, I hate doing VR games. I mean, they're fun to play maybe, but exhibiting one is a nightmare. It's like you always need to put it on, give it to, explain the controls over and over. It's so much, it's boring, right? I mean, maybe that's like an egoistic reason, but it's like, I hate that. So I want to just have an object that sits there and ideally is self-explanatory. And for Line Wobbler, I got fairly close. So people interact with it, but it depends really on the context as well. So sometimes I was lucky enough to have it in kind of a little bit like nicer museums, like art museums, but people are not used to touch things in museums, right? So they're always like, can I touch this? And they're like really careful. But with Line Wobble, you really need to like wobble, like twang it. And so people, sometimes they don't get there because they're just too gentle, like too careful. So sometimes you need to encourage them saying, oh, please do that. Kids they don't care. Kids go wild. So they have the opposite problem where they're just trying all different ways to interact. But then there's also other things like, for example, I showed it in Japan, and Japanese players are just so much better at arcade games, at least than European players. Maybe like here, everyone would be amazing too, but it's like really depends on the crowd. But there, like even older people, they just kind of, I play, in the arcade every day. While in Europe, it's a bit less like this. And then also the whole concept of a doorstopper spring is also very uniquely American and UK. So in Germany, nobody knows what a doorstop spring is. At first, I tried to explain, it's a spring on the door, and but they go, what? Yeah. Why would you put a spring? And it's like, actually, I don't know why you would put a spring. It's maybe not to hurt your toes. Yeah. Anyway, so there's like this cultural difference as well, because here everyone goes, oh yeah, I played with these as a kid, and they immediately know the mode of interaction that I was planning. So it's quite interesting to see these differences.
Yeah, that is super interesting. And so does that change the way that because I mean, if for those of you who don't know, Line Wobbler iconically has been installed in like a billion different ways. It's like so modular in the installation itself, which is really interesting. Does the context also impact the way that you choose to design the installation at all to like help encourage people to interact with it?
Well, no, mostly it's also a bit more contrarian. Yeah. I mean, so often the most common way to show it's just up, and then if the ceiling is low, also a bit on the ceiling. So actually people need to kind of bend back their necks, and it hurts a little. It's like you could say, oh, I don't want to hurt the people, but it's like, no, this is cool, like a game that is a bit more awkward to play, a bit more physical. But in a way, it's very spontaneous. So like I like to use the architecture of the space, and having an LED strip is a nice way to use that, because it's very minimalist, but you can kind of use the space as a kind of 3D level in a way. And I mean, that's lucky with the game, so not all games have this affordance of like using the space that way, right? But I don't plan ahead of time, so it's usually like, oh, there's a cool like spiral staircase, let's do that. And then it's often really cool to use the local space or a tree, and then you need to kind of sometimes look around the branches, and it's quite nice to have this physicality.
Yeah, as someone who's installed Line Wobbler many times at the MAGFest Indie Arcade, it is a really fun game to set up too, because you do have like the kind of like limitlessness that you were talking about. It's like just an LED strip. You can shape it however you want. We did like a dragon one year. We've put it like in weird angles, try to make it like a 3D shape. It's like a very cool installation process, which is interesting. Aaron, I'm wondering, for a game as grand of a scale as Haberdasher, how does that impact the way that people, your relationship with other developers, how people are interacting with the space itself around this? Because you have a lot less flexibility with this game since you need a significant amount of space.
Yeah, it is kind of a logistical nightmare, but it's one that I find is very worth it. And from another developer standpoint, really it makes networking easy because when people want to come find me, they know where I am.
You're repping right now, right?
I'm standing directly under the big hat. Like, come find me. I'm under the big hat.
You're wearing
I have my big hat energy hoodie on. But one of the things I really love about showing it in places, and I've done this at alt.ctrl GDC and at MAGFest, is that because it is large, it's very eye-catching. And my absolute favorite part of showing this is watching people walk by who are not expecting to see a gigantic hat. Because I think there's a lot of things you can do with games, and I think alt controls a lot of times amplify that, right? And so if you want to make the player uncomfortable, you can do that on a screen. You can do that more with an alt control. If you want to force players to cooperate, you can do that on a screen, or you can make them share one hat. And so it kind of amplifies anything you want to do. And so my goal is not necessarily, I think, like, games that want to torture their players are really funny, but it's not what I do. But I do love games that really confuse my players. My goal in life is to have someone walk by my whatever it is that I have made and go, what's happening? Please tell me, why did you do this? Why does this exist? And so getting to kind of draw people in that way and have that spectacle like Miki was talking about earlier, I think is a really great joy of having something that large, and makes trying to figure out where to put it when it's not being shown a little bit less horrible.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, as we talked about a little bit, one thing working in alt control is that your games has a tendency to break a lot. So what are some challenges that come from working in this space, from using atypical hardware materials in scale, in type, etc.? Do you want to kick us off with
Sure.
how do you store a big hat somewhere?
I think your problems, compared to maybe like more, quote, standard or traditional game development, your problems are a lot weirder. And it's a lot harder to find answers. We talked a little bit earlier about how the conversations with other alt control developers are a little bit different. And the reality is, in traditional game design, you're probably asking similar questions about various game design techniques. And in alt control circles, those conversations get substantially more unhinged. Because no one else has the problem of where do you put a giant hat? Or how are we going to wrap Line Wobbler around in this space? And so because of that, they're a lot more fun, but it also means that finding an answer is a lot more difficult. But I think there's a lot of joy in finding that answer, and that's what probably, I don't know about you guys, but probably draws a lot of us to alt control in the first place.
Yeah, it's also, I feel, too, in terms of the alt control community, because of that, like, almost like the lack of practicality in what you're doing, not only in like how you, like the way that you can monetize a traditional video game is very different than the way that you can make money. Like, you search for avenues of funding from academic institutions or from museums who are like interested in weird, playful interactions. That's like kind of your avenue for alt control, and so you get a lot of people who are in it for like the chaos, you know, which is like a great community of people to be like having creative ideas with and sharing your work with and playing each other's games. It's like very gratifying. I found, like, working in the indie arcade as well. I'm curious, with Line Wobbler, you created a full manual to like teach people how to install it and how to use this. Are there any or your other works, have you found any particular challenges in being able to get your work out to people, in how you have to set it up, etc.?
Yeah, it really depends on the size of the project,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, Line Wobbler was convenient because it rolls, it's like an LED strip in a little box, so you can ship it out and then say, oh, you tape this down and put the LED strip up. So that was amazing. But then I decided, okay, how about we make a huge wall, and that weighs like 300 kilos instead. And that's, you know, a lot worse, and it's a lot more hassle, and shipping internationally is a nightmare with import and whatever. So it really varies on the project, right? So, and it's, I try to have it like that people can install it for me, but it's not always possible. So with Quantum Jungle is a big one. I need to travel to all of them so far. But then it's also, I get these weird problems of like, how do you hang things on the wall? And you know, I'm a programmer, so I don't really know anything about this. So it's like, you know, in Google, like, how do you hang kitchen furniture? And it's like, oh, okay, you have this French cleat system with a diagonal wood, and you put this, and I try this, and okay, it works, but it needs to be, you know, exactly 374 millimeters apart, and it takes, you know, 2 days to install, and it's a nightmare. So you have a lot of iteration where you learn a lot about, I don't know, wood design or like plastic forming and weird stuff that you didn't really expect. But if you have the right environment, like a makerspace or something, then it can be really rewarding as well to have these skills.
Yeah, it's a very motivating, like, design goal to make alt control, because you do have to be able to know how to turn a toilet brush into something cool, know how to mount something crazy on the wall. Your games, Miki, tend to involve a lot of like physicality, like you're stomping, you're punching a punching bag. Have you found any challenges in making games that like need to hold up pretty well when someone is punching your controller for endless hours? But like in that design space, have you found any like unique difficulties?
It's really like not, okay, what do we do if this breaks, but what do we do when this breaks? It's like everything has to be temporary. I'm not making anything permanent. I'm not gluing anything down or sealing anything up. I'm making any like access points as easily accessible as possible, because yeah, like all my games are, you're hitting them for a lot of the time. The stomping one was using a Wii balance board, because we had tried to do custom stomp boards at one point, and it's just like that's breaking constantly, which is why we moved to also a punching bag rather than making like other kinds of materials to punch. And yeah, it's really like expecting your things are going to break with alt controller.
Yeah, at the indie arcade, we have a binder of what to do when a game breaks. If it's a call to dev situation, if it's try to reset and unplug and replug something in, because that's so common in this kind of work. But it's also like, you know, what's exciting about it. So for anyone who's interested in maybe getting involved in this design space, do you have any advice, Robin? I'll start with you, since you've been in the game the longest.
So it depends a bit, I guess, if you have a big local games community, and because, I mean, alt control is a small niche of game development. It's also a small niche of the local game development community. And often it's so niche that maybe you find one, if you're lucky, in your space, or it needs to be entirely online, which is kind of tricky because alt control is entirely physical often, so there's a disconnect there. But there is some online resources, but I guess it's also connected to the maker scene a bit. So there's maker spaces there in all universities now, right? But also like Fab Labs, and often these communities are very close to alt control anyway. It's maybe not quite games, but it's often interactive, and then you can come there as maybe with game ideas or game designer vibes even, and say, okay, I want to make something that can be played as a game. And then often collaborations can be found there. Otherwise, there is a huge online community around Arduino especially, where you find resources and communities galore online. Yeah.
Miki, do you have, I know we've talked about this before, when you don't have access to a makerspace or the like typical tools that you might need to create different hardware, how would someone get started if they don't have if they don't have like a shed that they can go and cut a crazy like apparatus to hold a heavy controller?
Yeah, like I think a lot of people get kind of intimidated by alt controller stuff because it can seem really intimidating at first, but it's way more accessible than you think. The punching bag game uses a Mickey, which is like a Kids Bop Arduino, for example. And a lot of stuff that I've had laser cut, I'll just exploit like my city's library makerspace. A lot of cities have free makerspaces in their libraries. Or, like really I don't want to say take advantage because that sounds manipulative, but like your community, you have a circle of people that probably have interests that are relevant to what you're doing, like Socks laser cut our saloon for the cowboy game. The amount of times I've had to like exhibit that punching bag solo and I don't have a car, so I'm like texting everyone I know, like, hey, can someone drive me and 200 pounds of sand somewhere, please? It's like there's people that are like really willing and excited to help you because they want to see this weird project that you're making. They want to see your art. So even if you don't have the space or the materials, it's really likely that someone in your community, in your vicinity, will or know someone who does, or something in your city has a free space. Like, don't just assume that it's actually inaccessible to you, because there's definitely ways to actually seek that out.
And yeah, I guess if you're already at MAGFest, you have like a community of people who are really into this, who are also here setting up their games, fixing them when they break. So that is a great resource in like building the connections of people who also do this. Aaron, I'm curious, like in the academic space, do you find there's a lot of resources for students who are interested in this kind of work? How has the like academic reception been to like digging into what it means for people to interact with alt control?
So it really depends, in all honesty. Like the institutional resources are there, right? Like in the building that I work in, there is like a $10 million makerspace with all the toys any alt control developer could ever dream of, and it's amazing. But I didn't use makerspace for my first alt control project at all. I built it in my living room. I did almost melt my apartment floor with a soldering iron because I did not have a stand for it, and it fell over.
Oh.
So it was really interesting, but I think starting out, being a student is a good time to do it, because being a student in general is a time where you can do something that fails, right? And like, it is not easy to make money doing alt control, and it is very hard to make a living doing alt control. But when you are a student, if you have the opportunity to try something small and just play around with what you're doing, this is a hugely experimental thing, and I think a lot of it really is just doing it. And Miki's right, like, you have people in your life who probably have knowledge you can rely on, and all of you have different circles of people, but I'm a big believer in knowing a guy. That's kind of my whole philosophy in life, is like, I don't actually know very much, but I know a lot of people who know a lot of things. And so diving in and doing that experimentation, which is kind of inherent to the process, because no one tells you how to build a giant hat, because there is no right way to build a giant hat, because no one's ever done that before. And so nobody's also gonna tell you that you're wrong. No one's ever gonna go, well, why are you doing it that way, you fool? It's like, no, they're gonna be like, wow, that's a giant hat, that's cool. And so the reality is like, pick a small project, I think, is the big thing. Pick something that it doesn't have a lot of stakes, right? Don't hinge your entire life on whether or not your alt control project fails. And I think that's just good advice for everybody.
What was your first alt control project?
I made an interactive coffee table.
Oh, whoa.
I had it in my apartment. It was very janky because it was a class project and we didn't have time to do all of the gluing really properly with epoxy, so we super glued it, and that wasn't great. But I do still have the coffee table. I've taken all the guts out of it and they will become something else. But it had like these fiber optics, and if you put stuff on it, it would like animate little connections, and like, it was cute and it was a fun social thing, and I got a good grade in the class, which was awesome. But a lot of that really was like, I had never done carpentry before, but I went to IKEA and I got a little handsaw, and in my living room I cut out the bottom of the table and scraped out the little like hexagon shaped cardboard that IKEA puts in their coffee tables, which is very satisfying. And I was like, all right, we're gonna figure out how to do this. And I think diving right in is definitely the way to do it, and then matching that with that network of support, whatever that looks like for you, is really the recipe for like getting into alt control and having a good time doing it.
Network of support and network of skilled people and collaborators who...
You all know some kind of guy, even if you don't know it.
Yeah. You just gotta ask around. Robin, what was your first alt control project?
I made, so I was getting obsessed with sliders. So I made a game. I decided, okay, what can I do with a lot of sliders? And then I noticed that some of these high-end DJ pults, they have motorized sliders. I tried to figure out, I just went to this rabbit hole and figuring out, okay, what is the component number, or like how can I find them? And I found, okay, they're not too expensive, like $10 each. They're not super cheap, but not super expensive. So I bought a few and then said, okay, what can I do? Can I touch them? Can it be force feedback? So again, it started from this kind of bottom-up approach. So I made like a dozen of them, and I had like my little boxes, and that was just during the Flappy Bird craze. So this is like 12 years ago or something. It's 30. It's a while ago. And so I made like a game, but you control the pipes instead. So it's like and then a few other mini games where it uses the force feedback in a little interesting way. So a lot of small games. Neither of them was that great, but it was a cool experiment to see. That worked. Yeah.
And Miki, what was your first?
So yeah, that was that 2-player bird racing game that I made with Michelle. And this was, you have to like stomp to run and then like flap your wings to fly. So it again made people kind of chicken dance basically as fast as possible. We were very much inspired by, the spectacle of things, stuff like DDR, where it's like, okay, not only is someone making these huge motions, but it kind of draws people in to watch people make these huge silly motions. And I think something really fun about that one was realizing that like people are a lot better at this game than I am at the game. And they start finding out different strategies that I never thought about, which I guess is like kind of like what Aaron does in a lot more academic sense than I'm doing it, where I'm just like, that's funny. But it's like making people, I think that was the game that kind of got me interested in seeing how people actually interact with this system that I'm forcing them to engage with.
Yeah, I guess that kind of leads to my next question, which, since these first early experiments, what is the most rewarding thing about working with alt control? Like, why have you continued to do it since the beginning?
Yeah, I do think the huge reward of that is seeing people get introduced with an object, again, this everyday object that they're not necessarily like thinking of as a controller, and being forced to interact with it in a different way, and seeing how they actually get good at the thing and they become, again, better at it than I am. And it's interesting creating a system that people want to engage with in a weird way. And then again, this kind of collaborative storytelling aspect where people kind of play together or play against each other in ways that I can't always predict. One big thing about that is these party games that we've been making, where it's like everyone's going to interact with it in a different way. And every time we've shown like the punching bag tournament style, like something different happens within this narrative. Like people get really excited about like these downgrades you can buy, and it starts to like ramp the whole room up. And it's just like seeing what happens that I wasn't predicting. It's like I'm making a little storytelling system, I feel like, and then forcing people to tell their own story within it, and then I get to like see how that story plays out.
Yeah, that's amazing. You get to when you design a space, you can design how people are going to interact with your story, I guess, which is really cool. And so much of alt control too is like the sculpture of it, the physical object, as we were talking about. For you, Robin, what is the most rewarding thing?
It's I think it's probably just seeing people enjoying themselves. So it's very similar to what Miki said, that it is seeing people interact with a thing they know, but it's presented in a different way. I mean, my games are not really that like story heavy or not necessarily cooperative either, but I do like seeing people discover what the object does. It's like, ooh, is this a game? It's like this kind of discovery process is very interesting to me, to see, okay, that where they get surprised or joy by touching it, and it's like, oh wow, this reacts, or does this thing, and just standing back and seeing people interact with it and having fun is, I think, for me, is the best. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I know you talked about, Aaron, just the joy of having people walk by and being like, what is happening? But I'm curious if you have any more insight, like what is the most rewarding thing? What do you enjoy about alt control the most?
Yeah, I mean, we've all talked about it a little bit. We're all game developers at heart, and one of the best parts about game development is putting your game in front of someone and them enjoying it, right? Like that is like the greatest joy. But I think one of the other things that is really rewarding about doing alt control is the fun of that experimental process. Like, it feels like playing a lot of the time, because usually you have some ridiculous idea, like, what if I made a game where the players are crabs and they're jousting and I make human-sized crab claws? And like, that's inherently funny, And then the process to get from that idea to realizing that, which is no one steal that idea, I'm working on it, is this process of trial and error that feels like a very satisfying problem-solving process, because there's a lot of intermediate steps and the feeling of one of those things working. And so, for example, when I discovered, I was trying to figure out how to put a nice surface on my hat, because the foam that I used to sculpt it looked terrible. It gave me a beautiful shape and the outside was very sad. And I discovered the magic of lightweight spackle, which is one of my favorite things, Ace Hardware, my beloved. And putting it on is kind of like this very zen feeling. It feels like frosting a cake, but just learning that it's like, this is a fun process. I tried a couple of things and I found the thing that worked, and that satisfaction and getting to hit that multiple times through experiments. Oh, this is gonna work for this aspect and this is gonna work for that aspect feels really good.
Yeah, there is this weird synergy of, it feels like the regular or the typical game development process for a video game is very different from the player's experience of playing it. But with alt.ctrl, they're more similar in some way, that you're not only am I'm figuring out what this toilet brush does and what the affordances are and how I can play with it. And then you watch people who are playing the game have that same process, or reverse engineer that kind of process of now, I'm being confronted with this controller that I've never used before, and this is so weird, and coming up with those same realizations, which I think is a really beautiful aspect of this work too. Does anyone have any crazy stories of people interacting with their work in weird ways, or ways that surprised you that you didn't intend maybe?
So the first prototype of the punching bag, which we did for the party, me and Kana's party, it was so last minute. The initial idea was the controller was going to be these teddy bears that you're hitting, because we thought that'd be funny. You're punching these teddy bears, right? And it was going to be the positive and the negative separated by some kind of squishy thing, but it just wouldn't depress quick enough for how fast people are punching. So we're okay, last minute decision is positive and negative, that you connect with your skin contact, which works with the Makey. And again, this was an hour before the party, so we had a trash bag over the punching bag, and we used tin foil because that's conductive, right? And it's flexible. And what we did not expect is if you're punching tin foil for an hour, you get bloody. And so, so we invited 20, 30 people to our house to punch this punching bag, and people are bleeding everywhere. Oh no. And we had the party was again Fight Club themed. We're all right, everyone has to dress up like a Miami Vice kind of Hotline Miami aesthetic Fight Club, right? So put on all this fake blood, put on all this grit, and by the end of the night, people were legitimately, genuinely bleeding everywhere. We're I'm so sorry. So we use conductive fabric now, so that's not gonna happen to you.
It's I don't know what blood's fake and what blood's real.
Not expected.
Yeah. That's crazy. How about in haberdasher world? I mean,
I can't top that. I'm not gonna lie.
No one's bled from playing haberdasher or line wobbler, I hope.
But I think one of the fun things about the academic work that I do, which you can read more about on my website because I'm not going to talk a lot about it today, is we actually are able to chart what happens when we put two people in front of haberdasher. And we did this. We brought 30 people into the lab. This was the first thing we did with it. We're all right, you're going to play this game. We're going to give you $10, and you're going to play this game and let us videotape you, and then we're going to figure out what you're doing with it. And what we noticed was that we call it the post-coffee unclamp, where if a team of people spills their coffee, we were this kind of looks like a shift in this joint cognitive state that they have. And then a month later, we got through all the data analysis, we sent it off to the video coders, they did a great job, and I come back and I have these charts, and it shows me what every single duo did, and you can see it because we plot, here's where you spill the coffee, and here's that change in cognitive state, and it was right there, clear as day in the graph. And so that was one of the coolest things, was just being we kind of had this hunch it was happening, and then a month later we get all these spreadsheets back and we're oh my gosh, that was actually happening, which was so cool.
That is so cool that there's a breaking point and you got to witness that.
I have a chart about it now.
That's amazing. Do you have any stories, Robin? Line Wobbler is like, I've seen so many people play Line Wobbler.
Yeah, I mean, there's some parts that are interesting from more from a hardware perspective for me. It's like how to make it robust. So it's like kept breaking over and over. So I used doorstop springs at first for line wobbler as well, like tiny little things. But you can pull them, and when you pull them really hard, they just bend non-elastically. So I mean, then I said, okay, what other springs can I use? And it takes a while to figure out, okay, what is the medium that you want to use? And I ended up going to a spring factory and have them made custom springs for me. So I now know much more about springs than I ever wanted. It's like different, there's a spring steel and stainless steel, but stainless doesn't rust, but it doesn't wobble so nice. And it's like ratios between diameter of the steel and the overall diameter of the spring, and that determines the wobbliness. And there's so much stuff, but it's an interesting process to make it more robust. So like in the beginning, it always breaks. Like the quantum jungle that is here is a fairly early version, so you can see as you go by, more and more springs are like drooping down and kind of little, almost broken, because people like they party hard here and kind of pull a bit too hard on it. So I brought like 200 replacement springs just to kind of swap them out. But so newer versions, so because now I go to museums, they say, oh, actually we have like everything here breaks, and we want it to be as robust as possible. So now I need to replace all the springs, but then it looks different, so then the reflections are not so nice. It's like, okay, now I need to look into electroplating or electropolishing springs. So it's like these weird material rabbit holes that you go in, and it's quite interesting in its own way as well.
Yeah, you become like a specialist on things you never anticipated, knowing a lot about.
Your problems are so weird.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being here and answering my questions. You, sharing your expertise has been like so much fun to hear about. We have a couple minutes left if anyone has any questions for our panelists. Yes, right here. Yes.
Hi, thanks for doing this panel. It's great. I work in rehabilitative medicines, and we are still in like the 2025th year of our Lord using the Wii to like get people up and moving, and they're kind of, there's not a lot of Wiis on the market anymore. Have any of you been approached or approached yourselves looking for applications in those sorts of fields with like accessibility or requiring certain exercises that would normally be torture to convince a patient to do? Well, now the lights will blink when you do it. It's fun.
Yeah, if anyone couldn't hear that, the question was about if any of the panelists have been approached by someone who's coming at the all control perspective from like the medical field, or like for like accessibility reasons to like use this technology, since the main hardware used right now is still the Wii.
Someone in when we first did Soaring Scurry, that chicken dancing game, we weren't making that game with the intention to be more accessible, but people had come up and were like, this is really fun because I can play it without actually having to use my hands in terms of coordination. I know that's a very different accessibility than what you're talking about, like rehabilitation stuff, but I do think that is a big part of Alt Controller, is that it is more accessible in different ways just by the nature of it. But that's my only experience with that.
I think there's a lot of potential in this space. I don't know what's out there now. There's been a lot of work lately with VR. And I actually spent a year working in a lab that did VR for pediatric healthcare. And one of the great joys of that was working with people who genuinely wanted to use technology to improve the world in a whole variety of ways. And so while I haven't seen any kind of concrete examples of that happening, I've met with a bunch of people who do things like rehabilitative healthcare, and I know the interest is there, and I think it's just now a matter of making those right connections. Some guy knows a guy somewhere.
Yeah. There's some knowing guys going on in the healthcare field too. Amazing. So maybe any potential collaborators want to talk to the panelists, come up after the panel. Do we have any other questions? Is you in the green sweatshirt? Oh, sorry. There's
A lot of new developers tend to have at least one thing that desperately wanting to make work that just for some reason couldn't. Do you have any stories of something that you run into closely? Really, really wanted to work, but just couldn't ever figure out how to do it?
Yeah. the question was if there's any alt control design dream that you tried to make work but have been unsuccessful so far.
I mean, there's a lot of small ones. I mean, it's like, because when you experiment, obviously a lot of these experiments just don't work out, or they fail. So with Quantum Jungle, that was also a more game-like experience first. So like, I tried to make small games. I mean, that problem was more on the software side, I guess, because I tried to find a nice combination of, okay, this should be something fun, but I didn't quite find the right game, the right interaction for it. I found a lot of mini games that were kind of cool, but nothing was like striking. It's like, oh, this is the application for it. And sometimes you find them, and sometimes you just need to shelve it. And then later on, this quantum science project came along, and that worked with that. But it is often tricky to find these connections. And then, I mean, hardware-wise, it's, I mean, yeah, all the time. It's like, okay, how do you measure this? Sometimes a new sensor comes along that makes it possible to say, oh, there's now sensors that can measure heartbeat up to 3 meters distance. And that's really cool. It's like active microwave radars or something. And so you think, okay, can I do something cool with that? Or is it ethical to make people's I don't know. So there's interesting questions, but I mean, there's lots of them, so I don't know. Yeah.
So iterative nature kind of helps. And also that's not something I thought about. New hardware, like being released and being invented can really affect it.
I think one of the big problems I often run into, even with kind of funded work, is money. Like, there's a lot of stuff that I would love to do, but it doesn't technically count as work for my actual job. And getting things printed at the scale that I want to print them, because I haven't learned my lesson about not making giant games, is really expensive. And it's a lot of money. Like, you know, I was talking to somebody earlier, like a pressure sensor is $8, and that's great. And then if you want to make a giant net of them, you have to multiply that $8 by however many of them you want, and that all starts to add up really quickly. And so if somebody out there would like to give me $1 billion to make alt control games, I will make a lot of very cool things for you.
Right here in the front.
If I wanted to put a copy of one modeler in my apartment, is that open source or open hardware?
So actually it is closed source, but there is an open source clone of it that I don't necessarily endorse, but I'm also, I mean, it's so custom now with the Spring being custom made that it's kind of hard to open source in a way. I mean, I feel it's like my baby, so I kind of don't want to, but I'm sympathetic to the open source community, so it's like I point them to the clone, or you know, you can also, it's not a very complicated game, so you can kind of try to make your own thing, which I usually encourage. It's like, okay, you can, I mean, there is a few other one-dimensional games out there, for example, and it's like, it's nice because it's a very limited design space, so it's very tricky to figure something out, but also there's not too many options, so it's like you get kind of honed in on what you can do. But yeah, I never really made like commercial kits as such, mostly because I don't want to be a businessman. I just want to invent things, you know? I mean, there would maybe be a market, but then also, right now I use the best LED strip I could find, and it's like, I don't know, $150. It's not crazy expensive, but for a toy, and then, you know, everything else comes on top. I need to spend a day assembling it, and okay, what is my time worth? And is it like, say, I don't know, $300, and then the hardware is already $600. So it's more like more than a PlayStation 5, for example. You know, so it's like, do people really want to pay that much for a little joystick and a LED strip? So it's like, maybe if you've really seen it before and you really appreciate the game and you're a fan, but that market is very small. And then so the question is, do I spend the time there or make something new? And for me, it's definitely making something new.
Before we end this, if you are interested in alt control and you want to maybe participate in the future, see what other members of the community have made, obviously come visit the Indie Arcade. But also, we had a game jam in December where we had a bunch of different developers make their own alt control game with this controller that Socks, who runs the Indie Arcade, created. Yeah, give it up for Socks. So if you're interested in those games, you can head to that link on itch and check out what other people in this community have made. And please, can we give it up for our amazing panelists, Aaron, Robin, and Miki. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Happy MAGFest. Go play some Alt Control games.